it's time for us to check back in with Louisa in the book Mountain Path and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, you can look in the description below for a playlist titled Mountain Path. Louisa let this new life of teaching, a work which she enjoyed at times in spite of herself, and watching the people she lived with take up the most of her time and thought, so that on the whole she was fairly happy. In her thoughts she still saw her role among these people as that of a bystander and nothing more. She did not want it to be anything else. When ugly, painful things such as Aunt Elgie's insanity and Chris's danger and trouble came into her mind, she always, sometimes with success, immediately tried to put them away from her and think of her own life waiting for her in Lexington. And so the middle of August came. The corn was laid by, the cane was hoed for the last time, and on the roof of every good housewife fodder beans and apples lay drying. On Monday of the present week, the Lee Buck Corey cows, the Sally Hayes cows, the Herb cows, the Brander Seuss Mises, Pomp Mounts, and Rand's Dykes had sent all or a part of their children to school, so that on that day Louisa had 19 pupils, a number never before seen in Cave Creek School, so Lee Buck said. He was jubilant and bragged everywhere of my little brown-headed teacher from the bluegrass. It was 11 o'clock of a Wednesday morning now, and teacher sat at her desk with all the dignity due such a large school. She looked with pride at the 15 heads before her, all bowed above some form of study. Now and then a new pupil, not entirely familiar with all that the room contained, would raise his head and let a curious eye rove over some new odd thing about him. Louisa herself enjoyed looking at the once bare schoolroom, now transformed through the efforts of herself and pupils. True, the men who made her course of study, she had long since thrown it away, might have been shocked and a little puzzled by many of the things, but to Louisa and her children each strange object had a meaning and a purpose. The blackboard was freshly painted, while at its top were the letters of the alphabet and numbers to 10, done in Hayes Cow's neat writing. Louisa's penmanship was not of the best, and remembering the samples of Hayes's work that she had seen, she had asked him to fix the board, and in so doing had pleased the cows tremendously. Not content with mere lettering, he had at each end of the board drawn a pair of wood doves, resplendent with many fine curlicues and flourishes. The doves took up not a little of the needed space, but no one would think of erasing them. The wall she had decorated with pictures and maps taken from all the advertising material she had gathered through clipping a coupon and sending it out. Fat Rand's Dykes grumbled sometimes, declaring that the teacher is the melangittest critter I ever seed. The work of her geography class without books was everywhere visible. She had one day, in a fit of ambition, tried to give her class some idea of what the products of Kentucky were. The meaning of the term products was hazy in their minds. To illustrate, she said that Cow Valley produced corn. Lander said that down by the river, buckeyes were produced also. He said that tomorrow he would bring her some. That was the beginning of the collection in the back of the room. The children had brought everything: red and yellow corn, beans, cowpeas, the seed of various garden plants, shells and periwinkles from the river, a piece of wool, a foxtail, a strip of groundhog hide, feathers of birds and domesticated fowls, tiny gourds of the variety known as nest egg, Indian arrowheads, geodes broken by accident in some road and revealing their nest of glittering pink and white quartz, and a host of wild fruits, nuts, and berries from the wood. Thus what began as geography blossomed into nature study, agriculture, and general science. They talked about some one of the things every day, and each child who could write would take something to his desk and there write a story or draw a picture as his fancy suited. Louisa gave such activities the name of language, and trembled with fear lest Superintendent Russell might someday come in and find that she was not on page so-and-so of her textbook as directed by the course of study. But then she had no textbook anyway, and he never came. Geography without books or maps progressed too. Rye had one day come to Louisa with a teaching project in which the stove played a prominent part. It all began with a geography lesson in which teacher told them that the world was round. They knew that. It had been settled fact for some years now that teachers might teach that if they wished, though the older inhabitants could remember when things were a long sight different. What interested the teacher most was what teacher told them about a globe, a round thing with a colored map on it. Teacher expressed a desire for one, but no hope. Rye was unusually quiet for the remainder of the afternoon, but every once in a while her eyes would stray to the lower of the fat black bellies of the stove, then away to a box of colored chalk by the blackboard. After a long time she raised her hand. "Teacher, the stove's round." "Yes," Louisa agreed, with no inkling of what lay in store for the stove. "And one of them there globes is round, and me and you and Lander can draw, and the chalk's got colors." She stopped, seeing no need to say any more. Louisa gasped a little, but after all, Rye was Corey's child, and Corey had made a spittin'-proof stir. "Just what do you mean?" she asked, wishing to give the young inventress full scope. "I mean to make us one of them globes on the stove. We won't be using it for a spell, and the door can be somers we won't talk about. We could put Somerset County on there behind where it's nice and shiny." All books, slates, and pencils were laid aside for the time being, and everybody went to work on the stove. First it was rubbed smooth as possible with sandstone, then teacher and Rye and Lander painstakingly drew on the continents, while Royal Mounts and Mark Dykes took turns putting on blue oceans. True, there was no place for the Arctic regions, and the place designated as Australia bore the words Louisville, Kentucky, together with the name of a well-known stove manufacturing concern, but there was no denying that it was a globe with all the continents and a bright red spot for Hargistown. Not content with a mere globe, Rye went even further. Next day, she and Mabel were gone a remarkably long time to the spring, leaving shortly after morning recess and returning at well-nigh dinner time, covered with Spanish needles, corn pollen, and chigger bites, but without water or the bucket and dipper they had started with. Instead, Rye carried clasped to her stomach a large, round, bright orange pumpkin which they had packed clean from Pop's lower field. Puzzled, Louisa watched in silence while Rye put the pumpkin on a vacant desk about... Woo! Well, I had a visitor in the middle of our book, a big giant black snake. But he's gone now, so we'll continue. Maybe I'll put my feet under me, so if he comes back, he'll slither on by. I just seen him out of the corner of my eye and got startled there for a minute. He's apparently staying in the greenhouse. That's where he was coming out of. We could put Somerset, let's see, we'll have to figure out where we was at. Puzzled, Louisa watched in silence while Rye put the pumpkin on a vacant desk about 10 feet from the stove. She patted it affectionately. "This year, teacher, is the sun. She's round and she's yaller, and she can come up and go down." It took 3 lessons to convince the children that the stove should go round the pumpkin and not the pumpkin around the stove. Rye finally believed, but reckoned, "We'll leave it this way till we have to have a fire. Then we'll make a pumpkin world, and the stove'll be the sun 'cause it'll be hot." The fame of the new world spread so that the Brandersous Mises and the Herb cows started coming the following week and continued to come at intervals. More than one grudgingly interested parent dropped in to see the goings-on. The state-supplied books had not yet come, and Louisa could not afford to buy any, but there were more books in the building. They had come from her aunt and some of her friends. There were several of them, but few of any real value. The women, she saw, had donated whatever they had that was useless to them, and as a result, they were of little value to her. There was a gaily pictured book of fairy tales, but the children would have none of the fairy tales. 10-year-old Molly, daughter of preacher Brander Meese, going so far as to say one morning that Paul said they sinful lies. After that, when Louisa told a story, even the story of stories, the little elephant, she was careful to begin with a, "Now, of course, you mustn't believe this, I'm just telling you." She thanked her aunt's club with proper appreciation, envisioning as she wrote the loquacious reception the letter would receive from the astute body of women. The air would ring with phrases of pure-blooded Anglo-Saxon, you know, wretchedly ignorant, such interesting work she is doing. The women have perfectly horrible times, poor child. I imagine she is counting the days until the school term is over. They would say everything, in fact, she thought, with some bitterness, except that the beings she worked with were people, and that she had done the unsophisticated thing of looking upon them as such. The blanket classification of all people in the hills as pure-blooded Anglo-Saxon she found especially irksome. She doubted if there was a single pure-blooded anything in her school. Most of them appeared to be well-mixed compounds of English, Scotch, and Irish, with an occasional touch of French. On this day she was to meet one that appeared to have an additional strain of some richer, wilder blood. Her seat faced the open door, and often she would let her eyes stray through to the strip of rocky road stretching along the hillside. People she knew would never come up that road or go down it, but all the same she never tired of looking at it and hoping that something new and startling might suddenly appear there and so break the monotony for a time. She raised her head, looked, saw nothing, stifled a yawn, and bent again over Clyde Meese's multiplication tables. She lazily ran a line through 9 times 7 is 61, finished with the 7s, and continued into the 8s. She saw with approval that 6 times 8 is 48, and something in the doorway caused her to look up. Nothing was there. She reached 11 times 80 is 88, and again something caused her to raise her head. She saw nothing, but the sunlight streamed diagonally into the door, and now the shaft of light was broken by what appeared to be the shadow of a human head covered with very shaggy hair. She arose and hurried to the door, gaining it in time to see a ragged skirt tail disappearing behind a pine trunk. Rye, as was her custom when something out of the ordinary seemed to be taking place, came to see what the trouble was. Louisa told her what she had seen. Rye scratched a chigger bite on her ankle and then aloud it was Samantha T. Pettigo. The name Pettigo was one Louisa had not heard before. This certainly did not smack of pure-blooded Anglo-Saxon. Rye was only too glad to tell everything she knew about the owner of the skirt tail. In the first place, she was teetotally uncivilized. She lived about 3 miles away in Pettigo Holler. Her mother was dead, and her father an old man going on 80 and powerful weak. Samantha T. did all the work about the fields and in the house. There was a brother, but he was too young to help much with the work. She could read and write and sing My Land. She was thought to be a bit queer and had never come to school except now and then. Louisa asked who the Pettigos might be. No one of her pupils admitted close kinship, though some were related to Samantha T. through her mother, who had been a Meese. Pettigos had lived in Pettigo Holler as long as anyone could recollect. They had planted something called garlic there a long while back, and it was the stinkingest stuff, spreading all over the country and stinking up a cow's milk, till when people's milk went bad, they'd say, "My cow, she's been to Pettigo Holler." The Pettigos made wine too, so the children had heard. Mabel gave her this last bit of information, rolling it out in an awesome whisper as if there was something uncommonly sinful about making wine. With a stern injunction to the children to be very polite to Samantha T. in case she did come, Louisa returned to her desk and waited and watched with a good deal of curiosity. In a short time the shadow glided again across the doorway. Fearful of frightening the girl away, she continued to keep her eyes on the paper. With a corner of her eye, she saw the shadow lengthen until it ended and 2 small brown feet stood on the doorsill. The feet were still for some time, and the teacher, holding her breath in much the same manner of a person trying to photograph a deer, rolled her eyes half out of their sockets in her attempts to see more of the stranger without moving her head. Making no sound, but with amazing quickness, the feet walked, if such lightness of movement could be called walking, to a vacant seat near the door. They paused there for a time, and then, evidently having concluded that the new teacher was harmless, the owner of the feet set herself carefully on the edge of the seat. Louisa could contain herself no longer. She raised her head, composing her features in what she hoped was an expression of hospitality and harmlessness as she did so. She found herself looking into 2 black eyes, wild and sharp and cunning as those of a hawk, but so set about with a shrubbery of lash and brow and hair as to reveal nothing of their shape and size. The eyes wandered from her own and seized upon the blue canvas sandals she was that day wearing. Feeling that the blue shoes would prevent Samantha T. from vanishing again, Louisa was emboldened to let her glance wander elsewhere than the eyes. She saw a thin, muscular girl, small yet seeming older than the 10 or 12 years her size indicated. She appeared to be clothed with a single garment, a faded, ill-fitting, voluminously skirted dress of some cheap cotton material. Black, tangled, slightly wavy hair, growing low about her ears and forehead, together with long lashes and heavy low brows, gave her face a peculiar, wild, primitive appearance. Her skin was unnaturally dark, but whether sun or dirt made it so, Louisa never knew. Her high cheekbones and nose and full bright red lips threw her into a fever of curiosity as to what her visitor's lineage might be. She looked slightly Spanish, more Italian, and there seemed a dash of Indian about her nose and forehead. Perhaps 200 years ago an Italian had married an Indian squaw and given his features to a child who had in turn married a Spaniard. Perhaps she was Turkish, she looked it, but was there ever any Turks in Kentucky? Knowing no answer to her question, she dismissed all thoughts of what races might live in the child and set herself to think of some means of making her less timid. She knew that at present any attempt to talk with her would be worse than useless, for on her slightest movement the girl would be out the door. She remembered that Rye had said she could sing. The school often sang when there was nothing else to do, so the children, most of whom were yet unaware of their visitor, were in no wise surprised when teacher told them to lay aside their studies and get up and sing. They sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee." They knew it now and sang with happy gusto. Teacher watched her new pupil with considerable interest. During the first stanza she was silent, listening and watching attentively. During the second, her lips remained closed, but she was by no means silent. She whistled, carrying the tune perfectly with high, clear notes, and sublimely unconscious of the glances of condescending amusement the other children gave her. They sang other songs, and always after the first verse, Samantha T. whistled. It was noontime when the house ceased to quiver from the last strains of "My Old Kentucky Home," but before the children could go through their little ceremonies of passing the wastebasket and erasing the blackboard, Samantha T. had slipped through the door and was gone into the brush. Louisa was disappointed when the interesting stranger did not reappear at 1 o'clock, and said as much to Rye and Mabel during their language class. The little girls looked at each other without saying anything. "Don't you like Samantha T?" Louisa asked. Rye made a row of curly S's on her slate. "We don't know," she said. "She lives close to some of them in the end," Mabel said. "She and them ain't no kin," Rye said, carefully intent on her slate. "Mom said if was ever to come about we-uns, we'd have to be keerful of what we said," Mabel said, speaking only to Rye. It was plain that both the children had forgotten teacher. "I think she's a harmless critter, for Mom said she was. She ain't got no time for hatin'. She told me once herself. We best not have nothing to do with her, for she'll be packing tails, Mabel argued. Did you write your story, Mabel? Louisa asked, trying to sound briskly schoolteacherish. 10 minutes ago she had known these children and felt the same kinship for them that one of a species feels for others of its own kind. Now when they spoke of the other end, that feeling was gone, and she was left a stranger, watching and listening to peculiar beings that she did not understand. Though they spoke words that belonged in her language, the words, when they touched on certain things, grew strange like the children and terrified her. There was so much that was too old and hard for children, but the children understood the things the words hinted at. During the moments of their understanding, they were not children at all, but old things, hardly human, with hatred and suspicion so paramount in their natures that room was left for nothing else. Mabel read her little story slowly, her tongue heavy and stumbling. Her mind was taken up with sterner things than lessons for Teacher, and Teacher had no craft to call it to her, but was silent, thinking of the man named Jess. He had said, "If in so much as 2 hogs get to fighting, don't take sides with neither." If she had had as much sense as he who could not read, she would have said nothing of Samantha T. She had known that she did not live in the lower valley, and ought to have known the other. The blackberries were lesson enough. She kept her silence better when during supper on the Lee-Buck cow porch, Rye held Beetle and waved her fly switch and told of all who came to school that day and what they did. "Samantha T. Pettigo come for a little spell," she said, and added, "but I bet she won't come no more." Corey stood halfway between the table and the stove and held the coffee pot in her hand and considered her child's words. "You'd ought to be nice to her," she said after a little thought. "Poor critter, a-gettin' lonesome a-livin' way she does 'tween the devil and the deep sea." "Which is the devil?" Lee-Buck asked, and looked as if he would like to grin. Corey sighed. "We uns is all mostly devil, I reckon," she said. "'Ceptin' Teacher," Rye said. "Teacher wanted her to come again 'fore she knowed it." "You've got a good turn, Teacher," Corey said. "Now, if'n she does come back, don't let them young'uns be a-mistreatin' her. O' course, they oughtn't to be too thick a-livin' where she does and all." "Don't be afeared, Mom," Rye answered, and waved her fly switch with sober slowness and looked at Chris. So this chapter didn't clear up any of the mysteries for us. If anything, it deepened them. There at the end when Rye says don't fret to her mother, but looks at Chris, so that makes you think whatever mysteries going on with him and whatever trouble happened, it must have something to do with Samantha T, or maybe not her, but where she comes from there in the lower end. You can kind of sense that when Mabel and Rye were talking, when Teacher was asking them, and then they started talking about it between themselves, and they need to be careful what they said. So the mystery just intensifies. The things that jumped out at me from this chapter, I love the part where she describes Hayes drawing the alphabet and putting the little doves on the blackboard. And also she compares, and then the stove, that Rye thinks to make the stove into a globe, and she even goes and gets the pumpkin to make the sun. And then Louisa is saying, well, she shouldn't have been surprised, because after all, if you remember way back at the very beginning of the book, her mother, Corey, Rye's mother, is the one that figured out how to make that long stir so she could stir the pot of apple butter without getting spit on, without the apple butter spitting on her. So I love all those little pieces of beauty. A lot of times with kind of the Appalachian stereotypes, you'll hear about these people. They lived pitiful lives, talking about people in the old days, not today. But they lived pitiful lives, and it was so hard scrabble, and hardly had anything to eat, and just this terrible time. And some of that's true. It was hard, and a lot of times maybe there wasn't nothing to eat. But I've found, as I've researched Appalachia over the years, far back till today, one common theme is that we do like to be creative, and we like things of beauty. Now, no, it may not have been a painting that would hang in a museum, but something as simple as doing those little, he drew little doves on each side of the alphabet, something that simple, or something inventive like Corey made to stir the apple butter. I've seen that. I mean, you go back in these, like the Great Smoky Mountain National Park and different areas that are public land like that, or government land, and you'll see these old home places. Some of those old chimneys, there'll be nothing left but the chimneys, but they're works of art. I mean, how they got those stones, to how they laid them, and how they made the fireplace to actually draw smoke and to provide heat and a place to cook and all that, but they're standing yet. They're still standing all this time. I mean, a true work of art, true craftsmanship. So that part really stands out to me. I love the part about what all the kids brought, all the things that they brought in, real treasures. I've always been somebody that if I go somewhere, especially when I was a little kid, I like to pick up a little rock or a little pine cone or a leaf. I have leaves and I think that I'll remember where they come from. I never do. I should write on them where I get what. But I love that each child brought in those little pieces of their lives. And me personally, over time, I've realized that it's those little pieces that make up the goodness of our lives. Whether it is the first red leaf, or, you know, a pretty ear of corn, or a pretty handful of greasy back seed that I know I've saved and I'm going to plant next year. All those little bitty pieces of beauty, I think, is what makes life rich and enjoyable. So I really love that part. In every chapter, I've loved all the language. Lots of this I loved in this chapter, but the one thing that stuck out to me is at the very end when Corey's kind of taken up for Samantha T, and she says that she's living the way she does between the devil and the deep sea. So that's an old saying. Most often I've heard it, between the devil and the deep blue sea. So I love to think about that one. It's so old, but still said in Appalachia. Well, there's no sea. There's no sea nearby in Appalachia. So that's definitely one of those phrases that come with the people that first come and settled, who had seen the sea, who knew about the ocean, and, you know, and all that, had a first-hand knowledge of it, in other words. Then years later, generations later, there it was still being said by people who had never seen the ocean. They'd never seen the sea, but they said it because it had been handed down through the generations. So I especially like that. And probably my favorite part is that the teacher and Corey have a kindness towards Samantha T. And boy, wouldn't you like to see what she looks like? You can just imagine. I can just see a beautiful girl in my mind, but kind of messy, like the teacher was describing her, but with just that spark of intelligence and bravery and wildness in her eyes. I really love that image of her. But I love that kindness that Corey and teacher both were looking at Samantha T with kindness of how they could reach out to her. So that's very touching. I hope that you'll leave me a comment and let me know what parts of the book that you enjoyed for this chapter. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by next time so that we can see what happens in Mountain Path.